That's right, folks, the Gasser build is back. So I'm trying to mock up the steering on my car, and I have a smooth round U-joint that goes on the steering column. This is the steering column, and I need to mock it up. I can't have this thing spinning around. I really don't trust my welding on this right now, so what I wanted to do was find some way to mock this up and then have somebody, well, I mean, I trust my welding, just not with my welder. So I wanted to mock this up in a way that would keep the two pieces together so they wouldn't just spin on the shaft, and it would keep it from falling off. Also, so I can take it apart, have it welded, and then put everything back together later. So what I did was I drilled and tapped a hole 5/16 into, and it won't focus very well, but I drilled and tapped a hole in this steering universal joint, and then I drilled a hole about a third of the way into the steering shaft so I can slide this guy on here and put the set screw down in the hole. It'll work like a grub screw. So this thing will thread down all the way into the steering shaft, about 1/4 of an inch down into the steering shaft. And then what that'll allow me to do is keep this thing from walking back and forth or falling off the shaft while I work on it. It'll keep enough tension on this that I can turn the steering wheel once I do get the steering box in. Then once I get everything where I want it, I'll pull this thing back off. There's one hole so you can do a rosette weld onto the steering shaft. Then I'll take the universal joint apart and have somebody weld all the way around the inside of the steering shaft on the end there. So there's just enough sticking out. They can get a good bead on that thing. If I have to cut it shorter, I can cut it shorter and they can plug weld it. But they can also use a rosette on this guy. So that's what I'm doing right now for the steering shaft, just so I can mock this thing up. One other thing, I didn't have a great tap and die set, or tap set, so believe it or not, I just used a Walmart Hyper Tough 5/16 tap to tap the hole in this thing, and it worked without breaking. Nobody will know how long it'll last, but that's what I used, Hyper Tough tap and wrench set. Well, as you fine folks can see, this here be a steering box and this here be a pitman arm. And the other thing that's nice, I now have universal joint right there, D shaft, or double D, whatever you want to call it, going into another universal joint at the steering box. And if I come into the car, steering wheel actually turns the steering box. So I think that's going to work. Well, I get to thinking again, and theoretically, I could take all of my steering components from the bottom of the kingpin, the bottom of the axle, and move them up to the top of the kingpin, and run my tie rods over the spring, and my pitman arm. Actually, if I did that, I would have to have my pitman arm from the driver's side wheel on the back hole going to the steering box, or I mean my drag link from the back hole on the steering going over to that, and then have the front hole go from the driver's side tie rod to the left side tie rod, which would actually be on a couple of degree angle, but I don't really think that would be an issue either. A couple of things I got to think about, because I could have a nice straight shot right over to the other kingpin on top of the axle. I'd probably have to move my passenger side shock, which isn't a big deal because I don't really have the shocks mounted the way I want them anyway. Not really sure what I'm going to do for the shocks in this. What I had originally done is literally just drilled a hole in the top of the axle, mounted it to the top of the axle, and then I had a bracket where the steering box is now that caught the bottom of it. But I didn't really like the way that was set up because, well, you can't really see it, but it's basically just a cast iron bracket that has 2 bolts going horizontally through the frame, so all the stress of the shock is going sideways through those 2 3/8 bolts. And theoretically, they're probably strong enough if I use grade 8, but there's always a better way to do something. So I think I have the steering figured out one way or another. I'm going to have to either cut and shorten and re-weld this pipe for now just to get me where I can mock it up, and then once I get it all set up, I'll buy a new one and then just keep this one as a spare. But I don't know if I should use all the steering components on the top of the kingpin, or if I should just buy another one of these brackets and put it on the passenger side of the car. That might be the easier thing for me to do. Like I said, it would basically give me a straight shot from the pitman arm going across to the other side of the top of the kingpin on the passenger side. So that's where I'm at right now. But as it stands, the steering wheel actually turns the steering, and I am going to have to clearance this header a little bit, but I mean, what's a good hot rod if you don't have to smash one of the header tubes to get your steering or something else to clear? So as long as this works, what I'll end up doing is I have the bracket that came with the steering box right now basically just wedged in between the frame. So I have to straighten all that stuff out a little bit, and then underneath the frame, I'll make some reinforcements, kind of like a big thick L bracket to come down and catch that bottom bolt hole, either weld it or bolt it, probably weld it onto the frame so that I have a good mount point to catch the bottom of the steering box. And then the other hole on the steering box over here that you can see right there, I'll just drill a hole right through the frame here, run it right into that thing. Probably the right thing to do is to drill like a big 3/4 inch hole, weld a piece of pipe into the frame to give it a lot more rigidity, but because I'm putting a plate on the bottom of the frame, maybe I won't need to do that. I don't know, we'll see. But I'll have to put some spacers in between all this stuff anyway down here, because there's like a 1/2 inch gap between the frame, and it's kind of dark out so you can't really see it, but I can stick my finger down in here between the frame and this bracket that actually holds the steering box on. But this is one of those situations where just walking away from a project for 6 months or 9 months and then coming back to it, you have a much clearer mind, and it's a lot easier to get this stuff done. I think I have the steering figured out now. That's just a little update from Cranky Motorsports. I got the seats mounted last night using a whole ton of Unistrut. Stuff works great. I mean, it's strong enough to hold up electrical boxes and things like that on buildings. That's what they use to mount commercial air conditioners and things like that. So I have 2 layers of a 1.5 inch thick piece on the bottom there to kind of space the seat up, and then I have this rectangle stuff, the gold stuff, going side to side in the car. So basically this is picking up the original mounts for the bench seat on the floor, just 2 holes, and they're only 5/16 bolts. So I'm gonna end up drilling this one all the way through the floor. I actually need to move the whole bracket back to this hole because the passenger seat, when I sit in it, my knees are all scrunched up. So I want to move this whole thing back about 3 inches, drill all the way through the floor on that one, drill all the way through the floor on the front one. So I'll actually have 1/2 inch bolts, and I'll put a plate on the bottom with a big 1/2 inch nut welded on it underneath the car to hold the seats in place, and then bolt the seats onto that. What I want to do is put a 4-point like universal hoop in here, so one that goes around the door posts, across the roof, and down through the floor to the frame, and then just have little bars angled in the back going through the floor down to the frame to give it some support. And it's not really so much for rolling the thing over. I really don't think I'm going to end up drag racing this car. I don't know, I say that, but more than likely it's just going to be a cruiser. But I think if I put a 4-point roll cage in here, the main reason I want to do that is I need a bar going right here behind the seats so I can hook my 5-point harnesses up, because this car never had seatbelts from the factory in 1953. I'm definitely putting 5-point harnesses, at least in the front seats. And I covered the back firewall with some galvanized steel to cover up the hole between the seat and the trunk. I'm actually debating getting a Jeep Wrangler back seat out of like a 87 to 95 Wrangler, something like that, to put in here. I think it would just fit between this bump and the bump on the other side, be just wide enough to sit in there, and I would probably take the tracks off and sink it down as far as I could to the floor. But then I could fold the back of the seat down, have a nice flat area back there, and it would be good enough for my kids to sit back there. I can, you know, weld some plates on the floor underneath the car with some nuts so that I can put seatbelts in this thing, because they're definitely not riding in here without seatbelts. And then the back area back here, I'll probably make a piece out of plywood and do some kind of, I don't know, velour or something cool on that. I don't really think I'm going to upholster this, but the roof in the car is pretty bad. All the insulation's falling down. But a little bit of an update. I mean, I said I gave up on this thing for almost a year. I was just stumped with the steering. Had to figure it out. I think I got it figured out now. But it's going to be pretty cozy to drive. When I sit in this thing, my clutch foot comes up really high So let me hop on in here. Oh, not the easiest thing to get in and out of, but so where the steering wheel is, in order to use the clutch, my knee is basically touching the steering wheel. So this is exactly where the steering wheel has to be. So what I'm going to have to do is probably pie cut my clutch, bend the pedal back, and then weld the snot out of it again to make sure that it's nice and strong. But otherwise, I mean, I got the nostalgia feel. I mean, I got the blue metal flake steering wheel. I got the Hurst shifter, which, you know, again, this isn't the most comfortable thing to drive, but everything's functional. The brake pedal is really high, so I might actually have to, well, you can't see it. I'll have to get better video in the daytime, but I have to bring my foot so far up to catch that pedal, and when I move the seat brackets back, I'll have a little bit more legroom. That'll probably fix all the issues, but I'm really happy with this car so far. I mean, like I said, I stepped away from it for 9 months. I was just too frustrated. Now I'm back on it. So thanks for watching Cranky Motorsports. Have a great day. God bless. Stay safe and all this coronavirus stuff, and keep motoring. It's going to be kind of a weird view. I don't know if I'm going to be able to see the road at all. That's the whole view. I mean, that's the hood right there, and the fenders kind of bubble up from the side, so I don't know. Be interesting. I'm not putting a hood scoop on this, I can tell you that. This thing is going to be high and mighty while I'm driving. Catch you guys later.